So I just want to take this opportunity to welcome everyone to the Duluth Art Institute Professional Development Series. Today we are doing grant writing with Moira Villiard. My name is Jesse. I'm the education coordinator at the Duluth Art Institute. And just a brief introduction for Miri. Miri is a dynamic visual artist, proficient in a variety of artistic genres, including portraiture, illustration, graphic and digital design, and as a muralist. You can find her work all over the state. And she's also a community organizer, curator, and passionate arts educator, concentrating her efforts around issues of equity and justice. So without further ado, Miri, I'm going to pass it over to you to talk about grant writing.
Sweet. I almost didn't make it today because I got to this Airbnb in Arizona and the Wi-Fi was completely reset. So she just got me the password like 2 minutes ago. But yeah, Moira Villiard, I give a lot of presentations on different components of the grant writing process. If you have questions or anything specific that you want me to talk about, you can throw that in the chat or raise your hand. But for the most part, I'm going to get going with my basic intro to grant writing and kind of the highlights of what I think is important when you start getting into this art career stuff. So let's see, we'll put this in. I bet if I do presenter view, it's gonna not show you guys. Let's see. Audience window. Can you see the presentation? Did it change? Like, are the slides changing presently? You're on mute, Jesse.
I see the presenter window.
Okay. So we will just do it this way. I'm not sure why, like whenever I go from Canva, it's like this, but that's fine. All right, let's get going. That'll just be a cuter, smaller window. Yeah, so I created kind of a series of workshops that kind of look at the art or the grant writing experience from the artist perspective. I got into grants when I was like 18 years old, and I decided to serve on the Arrowhead Regional Arts Council through their student position. And then I ended up serving for 5 years there, and now I work there part-time as a grant writing specialist, which any of you are free to reach out to me if you have questions about grants or if you want feedback on things that you're writing. I'm always available for those kind of questions. Kind of the intro to what is a grant? It's free money. So basically, if you have an art project or kind of a vision for something that you want to do creatively, musically, film, all the genres, there's tons of arts funding here in Minnesota specifically, and in other states too, but Minnesota has what's called the Legacy Amendment, which I'll talk about in a little bit. Grants are free money, and panels are basically the people that decide if you get that free money or not. Again, like free money is basically like it's not a loan, it's money that you don't necessarily have to pay back. So that's kind of my overall intro to what a grant is. And yeah, panels are made of real humans. So usually the process of applying for a grant, there'll usually be like an application, which I'll go over what the components of an application are. And then that usually will go to a group of people at the Arrowhead Regional Arts Council and other arts councils right now. For the most part, it'll be other artists that are reading your stuff, or other people kind of in your field and experts who are available to evaluate art related stuff. And yeah, my theory as far as like how to write a successful grant is kind of like there's a sweet spot between excitement and thoroughness, which I'll talk about throughout this presentation. But basically, on the excitement side, it's having a story and having a reason that you're creating the work that you're creating. And then with thoroughness, it's making sure you're answering all the questions that you are given. I think a lot of foundations right now are kind of in conversations around equity and what it needs to, I guess, have have criteria in the first place, because there can be some inherent inequities in the process as far as like for a long time, people who are good at writing exclusively were getting funding because they could sort of navigate these systems. And yeah, one thing I try and tell people when you're applying for grants is to imagine you're going to tie with another applicant. So what are the small details that you left out of your proposal and what gives you the edge? Essentially, this happens a lot. I've served on a wide range of panels for all sorts of foundations and art different councils. And a lot of the time when we're looking through applications, people will tie. There will be like 2 or 3 people, and the panel will have to have a dialogue around like, okay, they have the same score. What makes somebody stand out in this space? And usually it's either something to do with how exciting your project is, or something to do with how thoroughly you've answered the questions. My motivational pep talk for folks, and oh my gosh, I'm trying to catch my breath because this Airbnb literally has a ton of air fresheners. I cannot breathe. One thing I remind people when they're doing grants is not to feel bad for asking for the money. A lot of the time grants, like the money for grants, is sourced from different institutions or corporations a lot of the time that get tax write-offs anyway for giving away this money. It benefits them to give away money. So you're definitely helping somebody else out by taking funding from the grant world. And then this, the special note here is that Minnesota has the legacy amendment, which was like, I believe like a 25-year plan to invest, into arts, culture, environment in the state. I'm not the greatest at going over the technical details of that, but essentially our government here in Minnesota is subsidizing a lot of people or a lot of artists. So we have the State Arts Board and then the Regional Arts Councils, which I believe there's 7. And they're spread kind of by different geographies around the state. And so that every geography in Minnesota has an arts council. Those are generally less competitive grants. The Arrowhead Regional Arts Council, where I work, is the largest geographic area. So we are, that's where I got the number 7 from. We're a 7-county area. Kind of the whole northeastern part of Minnesota. It covers quite a few different communities. But yeah, basically a lot of these places, they have to give away the money no matter what. So oftentimes you're helping the funder. And I also encourage people to not ever like lowball yourself when you're asking for money, because oftentimes that can actually go against you when you're writing your grant, because it's a feasibility issue, which I'll talk a little bit about criteria in a second, but feasibility is one of those things that is important to evaluate when you're applying for a grant. Yeah, what can I find money for? So I like to think of the types of grants there are as being in sort of like 2 different categories. There's like projects, which I would define as anything with a start and a finish. And then there's non-projects, which are a little bit more sometimes time-based and sometimes just abstract to think about. Under projects, I'm sure you all can read this, but you have your typical like visual art exhibit or experience, films, albums, books, concerts, and basically anything that has an actual output of you creating new work. And then additionally, any supplies or equipment tied to any of these, funds to host events, classes, research or apprenticeships, travel costs, sometimes fellowships. If I put fellowships, I think, in both categories because it depends on what the fellowship specifically is for. Fellowship is usually like a large sum of money. So in the last year, I got the McKnight Fellowship, which was a $25,000 grant. And that was kind of like support overall for just me being an artist in my field and giving me the resources to just explore during a 1-year period. And on the non-project side, there's equipment or supplies kind of just generally. So if it's not necessarily tied to a project, there's not a lot of funding resources for this type of non-project work. Just because there's restrictions I think funders have in that area. Emergencies, so there's a lot of area regional arts councils that have emergency funding. I believe we have a $750 fund for like emergencies. So it wouldn't be something that you could predict. It could be like if someone stole your computer, or if somebody, like your equipment broke, like you drop your lenses and you have to do a photo shoot in a day. Those usually have a quicker turnaround time. Sometimes paying your rent, I've seen people write grants that have been compelling to say that, like, you can't create the work without the space, so paying for the rent to live or exist. We try and kind of steer people away from, I guess, listing those more personal things explicitly anymore, because there's sort of a push to encouraging artists to pay themselves. And so if you pay yourself, we don't ask questions on what you do with that money. So if you choose to pay your rent with the entire artist stipend that you paid yourself, as long as you created work during that period of time that you said you were going to in the grant application, you're probably fine. We don't need to know it went to rent. And yeah. Kind of the breakdown of how a project is generally evaluated. There's usually criteria. A lot of places will use things like merit, feasibility, which is basically the ability to have the project come to life, impact, which is if, say, like a lot of foundations and funders will have grants that are for emerging artists. I think there's a movement right now to kind of move away from calling things emerging artists. But for now, there's still a lot of opportunities like that, where if you're early in your career, sometimes that first grant is going to have a huge impact on you as an artist. So you can make that case in a lot of funds. Let's see. Yeah, I think impact is oftentimes either looking at if it's going to impact you or if it's going to impact the community that you serve. And then quality is what it says. It's the quality of your works. And I think that's usually evaluated at the stage, again, that you are in your career. So I've written grants where I've been not the best at something and I want to learn to be better. And so I write a grant to pursue opportunities that make me better at a certain activity. I think there's in the painting world, it could be something as simple as like, I want to learn color theory or whatever. If you didn't go to school for it and you want to pay for a class to be better and then create work after that, that could be a grant narrative. Maximize the efficiency of each section and be smart with your word count. A lot of applications, again, are moving away from this. There's a lot of like shifting right now on that equity front, but for the most part, most grant applications have like a word or a character count. Make sure you're not repeating yourself a bunch in your application, because if we think back to the beginning where I was saying that panels are people, generally it's volunteers or people who are getting paid a small stipend to read through oftentimes like 40 different applications. And if an application is, 5 to 10 pages long, then that person is putting in, reading hundreds of pages. I'm not great at math, but I'm pretty sure hundreds of pages. And yeah, people can get really crabby. So especially if you're like copying and pasting the same statement over and over again, like if you feel like you've said everything you need to say, that's probably better to just leave things where they're at or have someone else read it rather than trying to just, again, copy and paste things over and over again to maximize the word count. Generally, you don't have to use the whole word count. And I think a lot of panelists appreciate when you can be a little bit, again, there's a sweet spot, but if you can be succinct and direct with what you are applying for. Let's see. I see a question. So what about when you do a project and you want to make a YouTube video to present the work? Could this work for the impact of the grant? As in, your art impact will be the YouTube video and it will play on using analytics. Yeah, I think so. Let me think. I think with analytics, those are a good evaluation tool for when you're thinking about like the quantity side of evaluation. So if you're evaluating your project based on qualitative and quantitative data, your quantitative data would be those numbers and analytics, but you'd probably also want to speak to the quality. So gathering impact in another way, like comments that are happening on those videos. Or yeah, and I think I have a section here on measurements that'll kind of go into those details a little bit more after I get through this little chunk. And if it doesn't, feel free to send me another question. But yeah, the components of an application usually are you're going to have some kind of work sample where you submit either links or pictures or sound bites of your work. And then let's see, with the work sample, you kind of want to curate it to your opportunity. So for me, I'm a multidisciplinary artist. Film, I do graphic design, I do shows. If you think about all of those like on one resume, that can be very confusing for some people who read my grants. And so usually if I'm applying for a film opportunity, I will try to only list the film things that I've done, film related things. So I make a specific sort of resume that's for a work sample that's curated to that. And then if there are like art exhibits that I've done that are maybe connected to the subject of the film that I'm making, then that might be something that makes sense on there. Just make sure your work sample makes sense. Don't apply as to make pottery when all of your work sample pictures are paintings. Make sure it matches. Budget, that again shifts in the grant world. Sometimes a lot of foundations will provide a budget form for you to fill out. Sometimes those are confusing even for me. So as someone who's just not great at math. But yeah, generally there's a template that they'll give you. Sometimes if you're lucky, it will just be like boxes that you can fill in and they won't ask you to be too detailed. Some foundations aren't super clear if you need the whole project budget or just like the piece that you're applying for. So if you have any questions on budget for anything you apply for, make sure you just reach out to staff and get clarity on what they want. Outlines and lists. So yeah, figuring out, I usually start with every single application being bullet points. So I will copy and paste all the questions into a Google Doc for things that I'm working on application wise. And I will make sure that I answer every question within the form in at least one sentence. And then from there, I will kind of break it off, sort of like in high school when you have I don't know, your thesis statement and then the details and supporting details, outlines that they make you do. Don't think of it that way because that might be off-putting, but just think of it as like a little bullet point list and making sure that you're answering or speaking to the thoroughness aspect of an application, which is answering all the questions. And once you answer all the questions in like a couple sentences for each question, then you can go back in and add the excitement. So you can add the why you're doing your project or what is motivating you to make what you're making. And again, sweet spots. Like there is a balance there too of not going too far into like only doing just answering the questions in a boring way and straightforward way. And there is some people get way too excited and into the weeds about why they're doing a project, and that can go over panelists' heads. You just kind of have to I find myself like adding and removing and definitely like sending my work to other people to read or sending it to staff to look over just to make sure I'm not making any big issues. Because it kind of sucks when you submit an application, you think you put like 3, 4, 5, 20 hours of your life into it, and then you missed something or you said something that made you ineligible. Usually staff can help you beforehand, like reach out to them maybe at least 2 weeks before the deadline of an application and just see what they think, see if they have any things that they want to point out or help you with. Because at the end of the day, staff are kind of your advocate in the room too. I think most people who reach out to staff, like I don't know. I don't have statistics for this, but I feel like in just what I've seen in the last 10 years, generally, if you talk to staff before you apply, your odds are way higher of getting the grant because you've kind of talked to somebody who knows almost every possible like response that a good panel will have in response to your work. Oh yeah. And that was my next bullet point. Reach out to staff. And a little note on the language that you use. Make sure that you're saying you will do something. Don't say I hope or I want to or things that make it seem kind of wishful, I guess. You're writing these applications basically as a statement of the work that you will do. And also, I think psychologically, when panelists are reading I will statements versus I hope, it makes them kind of believe you're going to do the work. It makes them see it a little bit better. And I'm not a psychologist, so I can't verify that with statistics either. But hopefully, you get what I'm saying. The artist resume is another component that they sometimes ask for. I keep one big long list of like everything ever. So let me see actually if I can pull that up. Resume. Okay, there it is. So I keep a big long one of all the things that I've ever done. I kind of format it with like my work history at the top, my education, and then the second half is really just like panels and boards I've served on, different cohorts. If you apply for cohorts, maybe I'll talk a little bit about these different things too. So yeah, panels and boards are like spaces that you've served on that are kind of like the behind the scenes work, like how I got into grant writing was sitting on a board. And definitely advise if you're interested in learning about writing grants, like go sit on a board. They're always looking for people and they always need people to read applications. It's a great spot to kind of learn what it feels like to be on the other side and then to also be in the room when the conversations happen about artist work. Cohorts are kind of a big thing right now. I don't know if my friend Carla is here, but she wants to punch me in the face every time I say the word cohort because I'm in so many cohorts. Cohorts are basically like group learning models where you can apply, and sometimes they give you a stipend to do the work, to travel to a place with a group of people and learn new things, to work on an art project together. Cohorts are just like groups of people that you can apply to be a part of and do fun. Like most of my education, I feel like has been in cohorts in the last few years. Grants and awards. So it's good to keep track of the grants that you do get because when you like actually start applying, it looks really good to funders to see that you know how to work with a grant basically. Artist residency. So I've been getting into these in the last year. This is where sometimes, again, sometimes these are paid, sometimes you pay to be in them, but basically you travel to a different place and travel to a different place and make art there. It's pretty cool. You can see my film stuff here, and then I have this big long list of exhibition history. Kind of keep it in more of a list format, but I try and break it up by year. What this sort of shows is that I'm active as an artist. So I actually made a goal when I was 18. I was like, I'm going to do a different art thing every year or every month for the rest of my life. Kind of like weirdly ambitious, but I did like little things like just like painting in coffee shops, and I counted that for myself, you know. And so yeah, like live painting at Jefferson People's House. When that was a coffee shop, I reached out to the owners and I was like, can I do like an art demonstration here while people drink their coffee, just to get that like monthly thing going. And now it's my full-time work. So I don't really need to keep that goal anymore because I can't stop making art and things happen. Um, but as you can see, it's pretty like straightforward. The dates, places, and the titles of the work. Sometimes I'll include links, but generally people aren't going to read links in an application. So update it all the time. Even if you don't have time to like go in and be like really formal, you could just, type at the top. I remember the show, whatever, um, and put it in sort of list format. And no, this thing is at the top. Okay. So I make sticky notes, so I'll just put a sticky note like because sometimes I'll forget I did something and it'll just pop in my head and I'll just put it as a sticky note on my desktop until I have to update my resume next. You can also set up, I'm getting a little bit into the weeds. I promise I'll come back to normal life in a second. Let's see, I don't want to go shopping. This little bar is in the way. Let's see. Sorry. The back end of Zoom is obnoxious. So on my website, this is more for me, but sometimes it's helpful as a landing page. I keep track of every news article about anything I do. Because these come in handy when I'm applying for applications. Some applications just ask you for a link to like a press coverage of your work. So it's kind of a painstaking, it looks painstaking, but you can actually, if you have a weird name like me, you can set up Google alerts and literally just Google alerts, and you can set an alert to be sent to your email every time your name is mentioned in the news. And so most of this is just like things that hit my email as a Google alert, like Mary Villiard was mentioned for the Chief Buffalo murals, things like that. But those are good for keeping record of and having links just for yourself. I see. Curate for relevancy, I already kind of talked about that. Artist resume is different than an employment resume. Like you don't necessarily have to list that you worked at McDonald's on an artist resume unless you can really nail home the point that it's relevant to what you're applying for. So like if you're doing an art show on like the toils of the fast food industry or something, like maybe list that you worked at McDonald's, but otherwise there's not too many or like if you're, I don't know, if you feel like that was a really like robust customer service experience for you, you could list that as like a skill that you got from there if you're trying to like sell your work or something like that. You don't need to go that extra mile most of the time. But some people do. My background is not in, well, yeah, my background is in visual arts, but like academically, I'm a communications major, and my theory about everything is like there's a way to talk to anybody, and there is really a way to write about anything and make it connect. So, if you feel like you're really good at making those connections to things that seem not relevant, sometimes that can be refreshing for panels. And then just think of your artist resume as your story of your career. Like, where did you start? Where are you today? Where have you been? The human condition, people, I feel bad that I mention this every time in my presentations, but it is like a very common thing to say. Like, when you're writing like an artist statement or writing about yourself as an artist, a lot of people, especially like starting out, will say like my work is inspired by the human condition. I always encourage people to go to the next step of that. Like, what part of the human condition is your work inspired by? Because honestly, like all artists are inspired by something to do relatively with being human or humanity. Is it grief that motivates your work? Is it love? Is it like pick an emotion or pick just a component of being human that fascinates you? And I think sometimes when we get back to like when you're in a tie, right? If you've got like three people who are tied, two of them say my work is motivated by the human condition. The third person says like my work is motivated by, exploring the grief of losing my grandmother or something like that. That one's probably more interesting than the other two. So just making sure that you're kind of like, I don't know, thinking of for yourself, like what is actually motivating or inspiring you. If it's emotions, right? Like what emotion? Stuff like that. So this is kind of back to, I think, Chanel's question a little bit about measurable outcomes. The grant world is shifting. We might not have as many of these in the future, but currently, measurable outcomes are basically a question that comes up on grants that most people get wrong. I would say, like, it's the most common error people make, and part of it is, in my opinion, semantics. I think the phrase measurable outcomes doesn't have a lot of actual meaning to people when they read it. And so usually, like, the common sense answer would be like, how are you going to measure that this is a success? That would be a question that the grant asks. The common sense answer is, I will finish the project. And if we go back to the I will statements, like, we already know, like, if you get this money, you're going to finish the project. Like, that's the assumption the panel is going into the room with. So I definitely encourage people not to just list that. It's not a super competitive response. And this is one area where, like, a lot of ties get broken. So yeah, measurable outcomes are not just the things you create. It's not hosting an exhibit or completing an album. The answer you give should not be completing the project. The whole grant proposal is already implying that you're going to complete the project. And feel free to, like, you can always, I send this little chunk that I wrote up to lots of people just as examples, because I feel like, I don't know, I don't believe in reinventing the wheel. Like, there are some really good ways to measure your work, and a lot of people use them. And yeah, shortcuts. This is a shortcut page. So things that you could use as measurable outcomes. The State Arts Board, they used to list it. I don't know if they still do, but I really like their answer of, like, what emotions or feelings will your audience feel as a result of encountering your work. So my project will cause people to reflect on the state of some issue in the community and take action or something. That, you know, that says more than my work will just be done, right? Some goals that people have are reaching, like, specific demographics or percentages of those target demographics that turn up in your audience. More specifically, I think for organizations, and when organizations go this route, like, you know, the movement to support more BIPOC people in different capacities, there's kind of like a line of just making sure that you have a plan to back it up. So you could say, like, you're trying to reach more people in a Native audience, but then if you have nowhere in your narrative that suggests that you're actually connecting with Native people, then it's kind of a feasibility issue. So make sure, like, if you're trying to reach a new demographic, tell people how, like, what steps are you taking to make that outcome a reality in your grant. New skills or abilities you hope to develop as a result of the project. So I've written grants where I wanted to, the style of painting that I do right now is kind of like surrealism meets portraiture. And at one point I wrote a grant to the State Arts Board that was like, I want to do a show. I kind of wrote up the theme of my show, but then I was like, this is going to be my first cohesive body of work. So speaking to impact, like, it's really important to have a cohesive body of work. This will be my first cohesive body of work that merges the two styles that I really loved. And then I gave, like, one painting that I'd worked on that was successful with. And then I showed examples of my portraiture and surrealism separately. And I ended up getting that grant, but it was kind of like, I wanted to develop my skills in a certain area. And one of the ways that I kind of measured that, like, measured if I was successful at that, was like reaching out to mentors or people in the community to tell me, did I do it? So going that extra step, rather than evaluating myself, like, having someone else look at it and give me feedback. Feedback is a huge way of measuring anything whenever you bring other opinions or viewpoints into it. let's see, types of connections formed through the process. So if you're trying to like connect with, you know, 3 more galleries or submit to multiple film festivals and meet a producer or whatever, who are the people and connections that you're trying to meet and you will meet, or you ideally will meet as a result of getting this funding or starting your project. Keeping within budget parameters is kind of like a boring measurement, but it is a real measurement. Like if you can keep within the budget, that's part of a successful project. Experiences you get to have as a result of the artwork being completed, opportunities gained during the grant timeline, and maybe some different understandings that the audience might gain as a result of your work. These are all things that you can use to measure stuff. Yeah. Measuring questions allow you to think outside of your project and look at the big picture of your goals. Don't waste the opportunity to have fun with this question. Don't make up a measure like I think at some point I had someone like take this whole list and use the whole thing, and I was like, well, that's cool, but do you really care about all of those things? You know, some people will use surveys at their events, and they feel like that's kind of like the direct way of getting feedback from the community. But if the questions on your survey kind of suck and don't interest you, then there's no point in having the survey. So make sure that you're actually like asking questions that mean something to you. Like you could ask the audience, what did you think about the combination of surrealism and portraiture, or ask them like, what would you call this style of work? Or that's kind of a bad example, but like just encouraging people to think in terms of like, yeah, more specific questions and that serve your purposes. I can't give formal tax advice, but let's see. There are actual tax people who will, who you can meet with who specialize in arts. I, at the time, was using Current Tax, and now they are accountants, I believe, or they merged. The guy retired. There's a lot of tax workshops. If you look at Springboard for the Arts, that's a really good resource for all kinds of things. But yeah, you have to talk to an actual tax person. Personally, I just set aside large chunks of money from every project, and I like getting a tax return, so I don't mind just kind of throwing that into the tax man's hands. Usually it's like 20 to 30% of whatever I make on a project. I pay off my taxes that way. And then I generally, for the last few years, have gotten a tax return. So that's been pretty cool. Keep your receipts, keep all your records of things. That's the advice there. And then, yeah, money leads to more money. So it gets easier after you get your first grant. Once you're in the door on the grant funding world, I've found that like it's definitely easier to get more grants. Like I said, when you have it like listed on your resume that you maybe were, I was last year a Jerome Emerging Artist Fellow, and you know it looks good as like for them to see like what you did during that time, and to see that it's like effective to give you money, that you actually accomplish things as a result of it. Make sure you're, I mean, ethically make sure your mission aligns with whoever you're taking money from. You know, I'm trying to think of a good example. Like for me personally, and some other artists in the Native community, like working with breweries and like for like alcohol marketing is not really a vibe. And so like some people will, like I've turned down a lot of opportunities to design labels for like beer and stuff like that, just because like ethically, I don't really know if I want to like put my creative services to use for that type of clientele, even though, yeah, like nothing against it. It's just not what I want my imagery used for. And it's kind of the same with grants, I guess. Like some corporations are getting tax write-offs for the grants and money that they give away. Like if you are an activist against pipelines, and you probably don't want to, you know, take a grant from ExxonMobil or something. So just things to think about. Making sure that you kind of look too, like do a little bit of like a quick Google search on like where the money is coming from each foundation that you apply for, so you don't have to, I don't know, reconsider it later on. And then there's this thing called fiscal sponsorship. So Minnesota is special because we have all these individual artist grant opportunities. I think if we, if you lived anywhere else in the United States, it would probably be more fiscal sponsorship, which is basically where you have an organization that kind of applies on your behalf sometimes, or that like you submit the application and there's a spot where it says you have a fiscal sponsor because the founder or the foundation that you're applying to can't give to individual people. It has to be to a charity. So they give it to the charity takes the money and then distributes it in the way that you kind of set up in your budget. They're kind of like the liaison money holder for those opportunities. Let's see. Springboard for the Arts has this beautiful and hard to find list that I always end up just copying and pasting, where you can see all of these different agencies and foundations. You can see McKnight is a pretty big competitive one here in Minnesota, and they fund all of these different mediums. These are our regional arts councils. How many are there actually? Okay, there's way more than 7. There's 11. So there's 11 regional arts councils. These are some national grants. There's a website called Artist Archives and Creative Capital. They both have newsletters. I think, let's see. I have a whole list somewhere here. Yeah, so this is another presentation I gave. I won't go through this whole thing, but let's see. How to choose. Talked a little bit about that. Where to look for grant funds. So I have a habit of collecting brochures at events that are similar to things that I want to do. And at the back, usually foundations and funders will require that once you get a grant, you put their little sticker or their logo on the work that you create. Generally that appears on the back of brochures and programs. So we'll like look through those. I'll look through like annual reports of other nonprofits and just see who's giving money to things that I care about. And sometimes reach out and see if there's any like smaller funding opportunities that maybe aren't advertised. Really just got to reach out to the places and see what they've got going. And same with the bottom of websites. If you got a favorite artist, sometimes they might be grant funded and they might share the logos and stuff for their funders on social media and credits. Yeah, at events, newsletters and listservs, that's huge. That's where I get most of my funding opportunities. So bottom of most foundations websites, once you find a good one, subscribe to their newsletter. And usually, like, you could even create a separate email account for this just for opportunities, and they will generally send those right to your inbox. You can look through and see all the different areas of funding that are out there. The Facebook and social media groups. So there's like, for example, there's like Indigenous art groups on Facebook that I'm a part of, and sometimes we'll post opportunities that they've seen that seem relevant to people in the group. There's probably like quilters groups on Facebook that maybe share those kinds of things or share different resources. Just look for groups on the socials. It's pretty interesting what you can find. And again, Springboard had that great list. Grants.gov is kind of like the main big one for mostly nonprofits, I think. Submittable is a cool platform where, like, if you want to submit work to magazines or occasionally foundations will have grants on there. You can just check out your area and check out different mediums that you might be interested in applying with. And then I mentioned Creative Capital has a great newsletter you should subscribe to. Festivals for like film festivals, you can check out whoever's showing up for those film folks. Ask staff, ask your peers. And then we have like the Duluth Superior Community Area Foundation, which I'm on the board for. That's got like hundreds of different grants for more than just art, for all sorts of community projects. There's often like regional funders. We have like the Northland Foundation here. We have a lot of funders and foundations in this region. And sometimes you can apply for something that isn't even like an art grant. It could be in another field. I know I've done like a little bit of work in the like social services field, and sometimes they get excited to see projects that are collaborating with artists. So you can get kind of creative and out there with who you're reaching out to. And then I think I'll leave it here and we can open up for questions. Otherwise I've got like literally 4 other slideshows I could walk through. Yeah, this, we all succeed when we all succeed. I think people get, grants are competitive, but at the same time, I think especially for folks living in greater Minnesota, like the more money that goes out here, the more attention kind of comes on us and the more foundations look to support people or see what's happening out here. So, it is competitive, but it doesn't have to be like cutthroat. We can support each other and not be, mean to each other when we're applying for grants. Some people take it very serious because it is a vulnerable space to exist in. All right, gonna breathe for a second. Questions?
Yes, thank you, Mary. And I do want to encourage everyone to either put a question into the chat or if you want to ask a question on video. And I remember, Mary, when you were helping me with my grants this year, I personally felt like I was asking too many questions and I was like blowing up your email. But I remember you just reassuring me that it's there's no question that's too detailed or anything like that. So I encourage everyone, even if you think it's a question that doesn't seem like a big deal, to definitely ask it because it's definitely worth being thorough. And it certainly helped me out asking a lot of questions when I was signing up for my grants and whatnot. So any questions you have, don't hesitate to ask.
Yeah, I see one that's any advice on grants that are unrestricted. Those would be generally more in the fellowship category. Like I said, like McKnight. I think for you, Shanoa, I wonder, let's take a look over here at some of the McKnight ones because they have that one, just because I know you like that one might be interesting. Given that McKnight, they usually their fellowships are like $25,000. They pick like 2 to 4 people in different mediums, and theirs are kind of partnerships with other organizations. So like the Center for Book Arts, I believe, is a one that supports like book artists, which is a very like interestingly specific area of art, of like making art out of books kind of thing.
And
Yeah, they
Mary,
have them.
I'm just going to read the questions for you when you're done with them, so that the people watching on YouTube can hear what the question is.
Sweet. But yeah, the fellowship area is kind of what you want to look into for unrestricted funds. Trying to think. I'll reach back out if I think of other things, but that's what's coming to my head right now.
All right, so we have another question in the chat from Caitlin. The question is it even possible to get an artist grant when you've never had a solo art show?
So when we think of impact, having your first solo art show is a huge story to an impactful story to share in a grant narrative. So I think just being direct with where you're at in your career, like generally folks who haven't had solo shows would fall, or I guess they would fall into the category of emerging artists sometimes, depending on the stuff that you do. But if you kind of articulate that, like, I am at this stage in my career, the next step is going to be having a solo show. I have started talking to, and like emphasize that you've already started the work towards getting a solo show, right? So start talking to galleries before you apply for the grant. Just get on people's radar and then articulate that you are taking those steps already, because that adds to the feasibility of the grant that you're trying to write. And then make sure you have like a work sample that's kind of curated to like what you want to do. You don't necessarily have to have the work for your solo show completed, right? You could apply for the grant to complete work to then do the solo show. I think in pitching solo shows too, you kind of want to, more successful grants are ones where you have a really good idea or a theme. So my first, it was kind of my second solo show. I don't know if the first one counted though. So I call it my first like cohesive solo show was called Rights of the Child. And that was the one I talked about earlier where I pitched it as I want to learn to merge my two styles. I want to create a body of work that reflects those two styles. And then I picked a topic that was very specific and interesting and that I could write succinctly about. So, and I guess this is a good story overall with like the grant writing process where originally I was going to do a show because I'm a human rights nerd. I wanted to do a show that was like, I'm going to explore the 7 United Nations treaties that the United States hasn't ratified, including the rights of women, the rights of children, the rights of people with disabilities, the rights of Indigenous people, which I think was like recently ratified. All of those things I wanted to do paintings about. And I sat down with my human rights professor just for feedback on my grant, and he was like, pick one, just simplify it. And I was kind of like a little offended at first, but then I realized like, wow, if I pick one, then this $10,000 grant, I don't have to spread it across all these like time researching all of these different areas of human rights. I can just do one really good. And then that could be my pilot for future exhibitions that are similar. So I could do a solo show on the rights of people with disabilities or the rights of women or whatever separately and actually apply for more money to do those once I do the little pilot project of just the rights of children, which I did. So having an idea and not making your idea too big, like, or for people who do like landscape paintings, sometimes they'll ask me like, what am I supposed to be doing? Because like they just want to do a show about landscape paintings. And I'm like, well, can you challenge yourself maybe to focus on instead of like saying it's a show about landscapes, or I don't know, nature, a show about nature, like focus on a component of nature. So make it a show specifically about different types of ice or different types of trees or different types of forests, but narrow it down into one of those things because I think it's helpful for your first solo show to have a motive that like challenges you to like the cause and effect of your grant, right? Like you will become better at a certain aspect of your creative practice through this solo show. I hope that makes sense. Yeah, okay.
So I have another question here from Jasmine C. And the question is, if there isn't a specific budget form, do you have a template or where would you begin?
Yeah, I don't know if I can have folks' emails, but I can send you stuff, Jesse, potentially to send folks after this. I can send you like the old ARAC budgets and sometimes if you just look at different grant opportunities. Wow, Carla's way late to the party here. she sorry. Yeah, but if you look at the different grant opportunities that are out there, sometimes you can just sneak through the applications. And even if you're not going to apply for that specific grant, like you can see how they have their templates formatted. It's basically just like, your project expenses broken up, and I'll send a template to Jesse to get out there.
Yep, I can certainly pass any information or anything you want to package up. I can certainly send out to all the attendees on the Zoom link here. I just wanted to say, as the education coordinator, I have talked to a couple artists who have used our space here at the Duluth Art Institute to host some of their grant-funded events. So, Miri, can you tell us more about how events and things like that help in the grant writing process or help build a more robust presentation to the panelists?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of, like I said, when I had that goal early on of doing like one art thing a month, I was very like self-motivated in that time. Like I give the example of like I approached a coffee shop and I was like, I'm gonna do an art event here, like would that be interesting to bring people in? So there's kind of, I guess, two roads you can take. Like some places like Duluth Art Institute and different more formal gallery spaces have generally different forms that you can fill out and applications and calls for art, calls for arts experiences. Keep an eye out for calls for art. But then if you live in an area where there isn't really a lot going on because nobody started anything, you can also just start stuff yourself. Like you see a wall, a lot of the time, like with murals that I've done, I just see a blank wall and I talk to the person and I'm just like, hey, like, could I paint your wall? And then most people don't even, I feel like a lot of, especially with public art, like a lot of people don't really realize that kind of like if you own a space, you can generally paint it or, change it in some way. And so, for like murals, I will usually approach the space or be approached by the space asking like, how can I make this possible? How can I make this mural happen? How can I make this experience happen? And I'll offer to write the grant. Some organizations will write grants for you, but it helps for your case to have already talked to the person and to be like, I'm going to collaborate with this library, and they've already sent me like this signed letter of confirmation that they want to do this project. Those opportunities that are already like on their way to being lined up, no funder panelists don't want to be the obstacle, right? Like we don't want to be the ones who like stop a project from happening because we didn't fund it. So the more things that are in line, sometimes it's riskier, but it's also like more effective because it's already like a feasible, tangible thing. So I don't know if that answered your overall question, but like reach out to people and create your own opportunities if there aren't any opportunities would be kind of my advice there.
So again, if you didn't catch it earlier, I was going to just open up this last portion of time for questions. And if you don't want to ask a question on camera, we have a nice little chat down here that a couple people have already used. So if you don't know where the chat is, it's going to be on the bottom panel. There should be a little chat button where you can pop up a little box and you can type in a question. So by all means, if you have a question, go ahead and ask it here. I guess one thing I wanted to share with you, Miri, is, and basically tie it into a question, something maybe you could elaborate on was, it's been probably about 6 years since had friends and other people in the art community try to encourage me to sign up for grants and to get some of my projects funded. And I just remember my eyes glazing over every time they would bring it up because it sounded so like such a big effort. And as a visual artist, like I'm not a writer or I don't see myself as a writer. So it just seems so intimidating. So would you give any advice to like first time people who are just intimidated like I was? Because I know that I've talked to other people since you've helped me to try to encourage them. I'm kind of passing along the message. And I know that glazed over look and that like polite nod and shrug because it
Yeah.
does sound big.
Yeah, I think again, demystifying the process helps. Like if you serve on a board, definitely like if you find yourself glazing over, just serve on a board and you'll understand things a lot better when you're on that other side. Um, and then just remembering it's a human process. Like it's not the people who serve on panels aren't better than you, right? Like the foundations, the people who hand out the money are not somehow more valuable than the artist who is you. In fact, like, well, we don't want to assign value to human life, but like you're very valuable, you know? So I think just finding ways to demystify the process and yeah, that's a big part of the whole thing. Um, yeah, I think once you get into the human side of it, it becomes a little bit more real or tangible or something like psychologically will flip, or I've seen flip for a lot of people. And then yeah, the money kind of leads one thing to another. Like once you get one grant, that's it. But like just make it your goal to get that first grant, and life kind of transforms after that, at least in Minnesota. Can't vouch for other states.
Certainly. And again, you were super helpful to me and a lot of other artists trying to get their first grant. What is, say someone who has never had a grant, applied for a grant before, if they message you, what's the best way to work with you on starting that process and getting feedback and kind of getting the ball rolling on that front? What's like that first thing if there's an artist who's a little apprehensive, what's the best thing that they can do to get in touch with you to get the ball rolling?
Yeah, I mean, doesn't even have to be specifically me, but like, because I feel like you can reach out to artists that you admire who, might be doing stuff in line with the work that you want to do. And sometimes they're receptive, sometimes they're jerks, but it's the nature of the world. But yeah, reaching out and making that first step. I think like with you, Jesse, like we'd met and then I don't even remember how you reached out.
I remember that I saw a post about like a grant deadline coming up, and I think maybe you may have tagged me or something like
Oh,
that because we had been talking, like we talked like 6 months before. So that I knew that it was the time to finally go ahead and act on that. And I messaged you, and that's how that started. So I guess from my point of view as the artist approaching someone for the first time, I think it's important to just stay involved in your art community, get involved in events. That's how I met you, was by connecting with another artist. So you just never know where a connection is going to lead. So I know that I met you through a chain of like two people. So it's really important to just stay active in your local art community or online. As artists, sometimes it's easy to
it's
kind of,
internet.
yeah, zero in on what you're working on, but
He's
community is so
frozen.
important. Community is so important.
That's fun. I'll throw
All right, Miri, we lost you there for a moment. I'll give you a second to reconnect. Thank you for joining us tonight. This has been the Duluth Art Institute Professional Development Series, and tonight we covered grant writing with Moira Villiard. If you have any questions, please visit us on the website at duluthartinstitute.org. Thank you.